This is a dispatch from Planet Infobesity, because the purveyors of journalism have exploded in the past few years. I think this is a very good thing, and I'm going to tell you why. We're really talking about massive disruption of this industry. I know that we've been talking about it already in terms of digital and print, and Jerome touched on the brand stuff now. But what Amazon and Google and Apple have done to destroy retail banking, they're now coming after you as well. And every company on earth, in fact, is coming for you. They're coming after the marketing and selling of news. Old boundaries don't stand anymore. It's just a fact. There's no point in hand-wringing about it. There's no point in saying that they should have Chinese walls. There's no point in saying that only old world media providers of editorial are the only people qualified to tell the people in the world what it is that they should read. That battle is over and it's finished. And I think that's a good thing too. Why do I know about this? Because after I was the foreign editor of The Telegraph, I moved from the editorial department to the advertising department. And I ran a self-contained newsroom on that side of The Telegraph, where we were responding to the massive growth in demand for quality content on behalf of our advertisers. And Jerome touched on the reason why there is that massive growth in demand. It's because ordinary advertising doesn't work anymore. But the result of that is that what they need in order to engage their audiences directly is journalism. It isn't marketing, although it's coming out of their marketing budget. Because if it was just marketing, no one would read it. They have the opportunity to talk directly to their audience. So although Jerome teed me up very nicely, I'd like to dispute one thing, which is he held up his fingers like this when he said it was media. But it isn't in quotes. It is media. It's exactly what media is. It's a lot of people producing a lot of stories that people want to read and share, no matter who's paying for it. So that's why they're doing it. And when that part of the Telegraph, the content marketing side, the advertorial side, the native advertising side, whatever it is you want to call it, grew very quickly in 5 years to an extremely significant percentage of their advertising revenue. I know how much it is, but I'm probably not allowed to tell you, so I won't. Of course, it was more labor intensive and the margins were lower, but the fact is that there was a huge growth in demand for it. When I left, we started doing it for companies on their own sites. We started doing it for their own owned platforms, which Jerome just explained. So we do that, and the people that we used to do it are journalists, really, really, really good ones. Former Financial Times journalists, Wall Street Journal journalists, New York Times journalists, BBC journalists, infographics people, former video editors from the BBC and the Telegraph, and so on. These people are responding to the fact that the number of people prepared to pay them to do their job has exploded exponentially in the past few years. Those are the brands. The other new purveyors of news we talked about already a little bit, social media recommendations. It seems to me that that's provenance agnostic as well. I think that the readers today of Facebook and Twitter who click on stuff that are interesting or they've been past things that are interesting are less inclined to care about where it appears, provided that it's interesting and worth reading and sharing. And then there are obviously the other new media people, are the influential bloggers and vloggers and people like that who are grasping the news. Well, all of those things mean that means that the older media are taking their place in a much more expanded planet of disruption. So as companies and bloggers and social media titans will reach out to these target audiences with what's increasingly well-produced and truly engaging material, I really would like to hear, and we'll have a discussion about that later, about what that means for the people in this room and the old media. I've got a couple of ideas which I'll come to in a minute. But before I do, and having said it's all very exciting, I thought we should talk about some myths and some truths right here, because I'm sure that there'll be some questions about this, and I want to shoot some of them down before they get asked. Companies are not trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. The essence of content marketing that engages people is about quality. Companies should be proud of what they're doing. Some obviously aren't and do try to pull the wool over people's eyes, but in a very short time, in my view, we'll start to see more companies proud of the material that they produce for people. Some are. I mean, you can see, for example, that GE produces a lot of engineering content and magazines online that it sponsors and pays for. Very little of that content even mentions GE. If you look at the Italian oil company Eni's website at the moment, they've got a storytelling website called Eni Day, which is quite sweet. And they've got a story up there at the moment about Saudi Arabia and oil and the crisis, and a very good examination of all that. It's their lead story. It doesn't mention Eni anywhere in it at all. It's a destination. They are becoming the sponsor of a debate and a conversation about the world in which they are in. The readers know that they are trying to sell them petrol. Newspapers are trying to sell you subscriptions and advertising. There are businesses. They're all businesses. If what the content is produced is rubbish, it won't get read. And that goes for the old media as well. In case you didn't know, there's also quite a lot of crap produced on websites of the old media every day. And that stuff is found out by readers and not read or not engaged with. I've got a nice little BBC story here, I'm sorry. Some people might disagree with me, and I know this is newsworthy, but a few months ago I was watching the flagship 10 o'clock BBC News, in which I saw a BBC reporter standing outside the flat of another BBC reporter who happened to present a motoring programme, who had just been fired. And so the BBC reporter had paid for somebody to stand outside a BBC reporter's flat and report for 20 minutes about the fact that he'd been sacked from a BBC programme, and that occupied 20 minutes of the flagship news programme. I was paying for that. It's crap, isn't it? I mean, it's crap. It is news, but on the other hand, it's also rubbish. So I'm not saying there's obviously loads of examples, and apologies, but you get my point. There's a lot of rubbish out there. And the other thing is that old media are not impartial. That's the second myth. Newspapers have always been compromised. Bias doesn't need money, but it helps. The boundaries without fear and favour have always been hazy. We all know about it with travel journalism, food journalism, and all the supplements that people have made. The fact is that is how newspapers have paid for the without fear and favour news reporting for the past 30 or 40 or 50 years. They paid for it with the supplements that until the 1950s, 60s and 70s, they never even did. Colour magazines, motoring, gardening, property, food, all of those things didn't exist in newspapers. The only reason they were created was to house the advertising that was going to fund the actual news gathering operations in the first place. And now that advertising has gone elsewhere, which is why all the money has been sucked out of newspapers in the first place. And I also ought to tell you, because it's one of my favourite stories, that sponsorship influencing editorial direction is extremely old. I don't know, I know this is an international audience, but I'm wondering if any of you are excited as I am about cricket. And the Marylebone Cricket Club, the MCC, which runs the game, or used to run the game, I should say, until the 1970s, is one of the oldest sports organisations in the world. And it has a very, very famous set of colours, a sort of really rather revolting rhubarb and custard stripy tie and flag. But that isn't actually the colours that the MCC always had. The original MCC colours were sky blue until the 1860s, when they were in trouble and couldn't afford to renew the lease on their famous pavilion at Lord's Cricket Ground, which is the headquarters of the game in North London. And they were bailed out, and the lease was bought by Nicholson's Gin. And Nicholson's Gin's colours were rhubarb and custard, red and yellow, and the MCC changed the colours of the club accordingly. There's nothing new under the sun. The last myth and truth I want to bust is that readers care about who's putting out their news and journalism. I don't think they do at all. I think they care that it's good. Their journey to journalism is different. It starts with the front page of a Google search page. If what I'm interested in, I type into Google, and if what comes up is what I click on, I read it. If I like it, I'll carry on reading, and of course I know that some websites have more provenance than others, but I'm still interested in the quality more than anything else. The things that trip up bad journalism in corporate sites are the same as trip them up for everybody else. And as I said, we can't be in a situation where the media thinks that they're the only people allowed to say anything. This week I started a fight with an old colleague of mine on LinkedIn. He's called Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson. He's the media editor of the FT, or at least he was. I think he's now their US news editor. He's an old friend of mine, and he wrote a column at the weekend essentially saying that brands weren't allowed to produce news on their websites, and I told him what I thought of it. Because it seems to me that it's just erecting walls that are going to get torn down anyway. I will say one thing. Companies won't do news investigations, or they won't source news investigations, and they won't do without fear or favour. So some questions for us to think about before I sit down. How do people judge impartiality and facts? We understand that conflicts of interest and bias exist anyway. I mean, bias exists in the news stories that you choose to do, not just in how you tell them. And if we are to ring-fence news and news analysis, which I think is very important, how are we going to pay for it in an age where advertising has disappeared? My idea is that the old media should be making space for the new purveyors of news and not wringing their hands. They should recognise there's a lot of really good quality content out there, and you can see on the home pages of some of the newspaper and broadcaster websites paid for slots now that link through to perfectly decent journalism, which I think is a good embrace of what else is going on. And of course they charge for those slots, which is a good way of making money out of them. We've seen instances in the past. I didn't see the gentleman who was from the New York Times earlier, but the New York Times, for example, last year or the year before, realised that there was a huge amount of revenue swimming past them that they weren't getting, which was this content marketing, native advertising, and they weren't participating in it. So they decided that they were going to participate in it, and they made the experience utterly, thoroughly miserable for the people who were advertising, putting native advertising on their websites by giving it essentially a different colour and an unreadable font and buried at the bottom a load of other stuff. The message being, we want to take your money, but we want to make the experience extremely unpleasant for our readers, which is absolutely bonkers, isn't it? It should be about embracing the fact that it's good. They can turn it down if it's rubbish. So I think we should be all trying to work together. I think we should be understanding and celebrating the fact that a lot of people paying for what we do for a living, which is a very good thing. And I'm not in newspapers anymore, but I'm still getting paid to do my job. And that's where we are. So thank you very much. Thank you.